Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Jeff Morales, High Speed Rail. Mr. Richard has touched on most of the business plan points. What I want to do is quickly summarize some of the key elements and then talk briefly about construction and bookends. And I would echo the comments that I think the staff draft does an excellent job of laying out these issues, so we're not going to be repetitive with those. In the business plan, with working within the constraints of available funding, and it's the first time we can do that now because of the commitment of cap and trade, this plan identifies three key fundamentals to guide the program moving forward. One is, as has been noted, to get into operations as soon as possible. The reasons for that are to show people the benefits, get people riding on trains, start achieving the benefits of clean transportation here in the state and the connectivity elements, and of course, as has been noted, to engage the private sector at that point in the operation of it and bring in their capital. The second key element is to make as many concurrent investments as possible throughout the state. Reasons for that being to provide near-term benefits to local regional services, and then ultimately to use those as the building blocks to tie together the statewide system. And then the third is to prepare to move the entire program forward statewide by completing the environmental approvals, and we have that underway. So I'll just talk quickly about those three elements. The getting into revenue operations, as has been noted, we project, given the existing funding sources available, that the leg moving north from the southern terminus of our current construction in the Central Valley to San Jose can be done within the existing resources available to us, and that's the basis for that decision to go north. And we are talking about having a train up and running in 9 years based on that schedule. The environmental approvals for the sections outside of the Central Valley are underway and scheduled to be completed, targeted end of 2017, and then we would move right into construction following that. The plan lays out the business model for moving forward, and Mr. Richard noted the concession, but in terms of constructing the system, what we plan to do going forward is enter into a series of large design-build contracts for the remainder of the construction, a major P3 public-private partnership for the rail infrastructure and systems, separate procurement for rolling stock and associated facilities, and bringing on an operator early in the process so that the operator, who will be responsible ultimately for achieving the operational terms and conditions, can influence the construction and the capital decisions that go into what they will ultimately be operating. On the concurrent investment front, and it gets somewhat into the bookend investments, but we're working with partners throughout the state to make those investments. On the peninsula, we are working with Caltrain to advance the electrification project. At the same time, we're working with the ACE system and Capital Corridor to make improvements elsewhere in Northern California, and of course to invest in Southern California, key corridor. And I'll talk briefly about the Burbank-Anaheim corridor because that's really a critical one. It's a 45-mile segment that connects some of the key points throughout Southern California, huge population base along that Burbank-Anaheim corridor. It's also home to the second busiest Amtrak line in the country, as well as major commuter operations and freight operations. There are very important near-term improvements that can be made in that corridor, things like grade separation projects in particular, that can provide near-term benefits for those operators, for Amtrak, for Metrolink, for Metro, and for freight, very importantly. And I'll give you a specific example. There's a existing at-grade crossing, which is the top PUC priority in the state. It's called Rosecrans Marquardt. It's south of Los Angeles. Just by separating that corridor, that will improve rail capacity throughout that corridor by about 60%. For all users there. It will allow the completion of the last remaining triple track segment for freight through there, which will greatly improve freight. And we'll have dramatic improvements for Metrolink, including service going out to the Inland Empire that will benefit greatly, and again have tremendous safety and air quality benefits for for the communities along those regions. And so our work with the locals is to accelerate those improvements and get those going. And in fact, our goal working with our partners is to have that project underway this year. And again, they become the building blocks for ultimately full high-speed service getting there. The third element is, again, to prepare for the next steps. And what that really means is getting the environmental approvals in place statewide. We have 10 segments that we have to receive environmental approval for. We have all of those underway, working with our partners at both the state and the federal levels. Our target is to have all of those done by the end of 2017. That allows us to adapt to changing circumstances and move forward on each of those segments. And the draft plan does identify that we have all the funds in place to complete that environmental work. Quickly, I'll talk about construction, and the memo again does a great job of summarizing, but I'll hit some highlights. We have 3 major design-build contracts in place, executed and underway. About 115 miles of work that is now moving forward. About $3 billion worth of work. It's significant to note that those 3 bids all came in significantly below estimates. And we have used we're using the design build process and have worked hard through the procurement process to take full advantage of competitive pressures within the industry and the incentives that they have to be creative and find ways to deliver things more effectively. I do want to note we are not assuming in the cost estimate, because we have dropped it, we have not assumed similar type of savings going forward. What we have done is look at very specific elements of those proposals, and where they can be applied elsewhere in the system, we have done so. But we're not just assuming continued low bid prices. We also reflect places where we're seeing price pressure, upward pressure. Some of the areas regarding third-party agreements, utility relocations, other things where we see estimates going up, and we have reflected that in the overall estimates as well. One important thing to note about our construction, because of our small business goal, we have 266 small businesses under contract today on the program. One of the very important things about a small business is that they tend to be local business, which means that we're creating jobs and economic activity in California, and it's really throughout the state. It's not, even though the construction is happening in the Central Valley, the participants are from all over the state, but you'll hear from some of those small businesses later today. 266, as I said, 90 of those are disadvantaged businesses. 32 of the 266 are disabled veteran-owned business enterprises. So we're very, very proud of that and that element of the program. Lastly, on the bookend investments, as I noted, the Caltrain project on the peninsula is moving forward. You'll hear from them today, I believe, as well. The goal is to have that contract, well, 2 contracts, both for electric trains and for the electrification system, have those contracts awarded this year. We're working in partnership with Caltrain to make sure that program moves forward. And it's significant that that electrification becomes, again, a building block for high-speed rail operating through the blended system that this legislature approved, and Mr. Gordon was an author of, in fact, that approach. Having that electrification done by the time we reach San Jose will enable us to actually operate all the way to San Francisco. And then, again, in Southern California, we are working with our partner agencies. We have an MOU from 2012 that identifies a process and projects to invest with them jointly up until the year 2020. We're working on that. We have several notable projects that we're working on with our partners jointly, things like the SCRIP project at LA Union Station, which will allow the run-through tracks to come through and dramatically improve efficiency by something like 40% at LA Union Station, and have huge GHG benefits. The Rosecrans Marquardt grade crossing, and we're also working with LA Metro on property rights acquisitions at Union Station as well as part of that process. But again, working with all of the partner agencies who are signatories to that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you kind of meandered through issues 1, 2, and 3.
Correct.
Have you completed your presentations on all 3 of the issues?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I know we have panelists on issue 3, but not on issue 2. So I think if it's all right with members on the dais, we can withhold our questions unless there's something pressing until after we've heard from the panelists that are here to speak to issue number 3, the bookend investments, unless there's anything you want to add on to whatever. And LAO, you have some comments?
Sure.
Please proceed. Sorry, Ed. Rejiggering the agenda a little bit just to keep with the testimony that we've heard.
Jessica Peters
Welcome.
with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I think my comments relate primarily to issues 1 and 2 of on your agenda. The authority has explained the major features of their business plan. A couple of weeks ago, our office did put out a report with our review of the plan. In there, we highlight what we identify as the major features of the plan, as well as 3 primary issues for legislative consideration. So I won't repeat the presentation that you already heard from them, but I did want to point out a couple of things to expand upon certain elements in the draft business plan related to the funding for the project. So first, the business plan does identify a full funding package for the proposed initial operating segment into San Jose. This is a more complete funding package for any segment of the project that would be operable than the legislature has seen in prior business plans. Specifically, the plan identifies $28 billion in order to pay the costs of this segment. As the authority mentioned, $20.7 billion of this is related to capital costs, and then there's another roughly $7.5 billion in financing costs. The draft business plan does assume that a portion of the cost of constructing the project would be financed. Specifically, the plan assumes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A bonds, $4.2 billion of which has not yet been appropriated by the legislature, and so this would require a future action by the legislature to make these funds available. $3.2 billion in federal funds that have already been appropriated to the authority, and $17.8 billion from cap and trade auction revenues. And this would include auction revenues through the year 2050. In terms of how the authority would use the funds, they would use the funds through 2024 on a pay-as-you-go basis. That would cover about $5.3 billion of the cost of this operating segment. Then the authority also assumes about $12.5–13 billion in funds from 2025 through 2050. And these funds would support the proposed financing to pay the remainder of the cost of the initial operating segment. Specifically, the authority estimates this would generate about $5.2 billion in financing proceeds to pay for those capital costs up front through a securitization of these revenues, and with the balance of about $7.5 billion going for paying the financing costs that would be required under such a securitization. With regard to the funding plan for the remainder of the system, for Phase 1, San Francisco to Anaheim, the business plan does not identify a full funding plan for how the authority would pay the roughly $44 billion in costs to complete the system beyond the initial operating segment. As the authority has testified already, there's some different sources of funding that are contemplated that might be available, but the plan does not identify a way to fully pay for the costs of completing Phase 1 of the system. In terms of issues that we have identified for the legislature to consider, the first one is the uncertainties regarding the funding plan for Phase 1, and I'll speak to this in 2 different components. First, regarding the funding plan for the initial operating segment to San Jose. As I said previously, this is a more complete funding package for an operable segment of the system than the authority has presented in prior business plans, and so that's a step in the right direction. But we would note that about half of the funding that the business plan relies on would come from cap and trade auction revenues after the year 2020. It is our understanding that the cap and trade program is not authorized beyond the year 2020, and so this would appear to require legislative action in order to extend these funds. We think that that's something the legislature is going to want to consider on the merits of the cap and trade program and that program's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To the extent that you choose to extend that program, the funds could be available for high-speed rail, but we think it should be considered on its own merits. Even if those legal uncertainties were resolved and the cap and trade program were extended, we think the proposed securitization of cap and trade revenues over the longer term would require additional legislative action. The way that the continuous appropriation to the authority is currently structured, we don't think would be sufficient to provide the level of certainty that investors would need in order to facilitate a securitization. And so we think additional steps would be needed by the legislature. For example, you could change the appropriation to make the repayment of high-speed rail financing the first call on cap and trade auction revenues, or provide a certain minimum amount in order to provide the certainty that would be necessary in order to securitize that revenue stream over the long run. The other point regarding uncertainties for the funding plan is that the authority has not identified a complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. Under their plan, they would exhaust all of the identified funding sources to build the initial operating segment into San Jose. This would leave a funding gap of about $44 billion and no identified funding sources for how they would complete the system. As Mr. Richard had testified, the authority would plan to securitize operating revenues of the system once they get a portion of the system up and running. It's uncertain to us at this point, and I think even to the private sector, to what extent, how much operating revenue or net revenue there would be, or operating profit there would be. I think Mr. Richard indicated that the private sector would like to see some actual numbers, and so there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and so it's unclear to us to what extent that would be an available funding source. Even if it did become available at the level that the authority is estimating, under their estimates, they would have roughly $3 to $7 billion that they could securitize from that initial operating segment, depending on the specific scope, that could be used to fund the rest of Phase 1. That amount falls significantly short of the amount necessary to fill that $44 billion funding gap to complete Phase 1 of the system. We think that having a complete funding plan for Phase 1 is critical, and that's going to be an issue that you want to consider, and to the extent that the authority is developing that plan for the rest of the system. The second issue for legislative consideration that we identified ties into the issue of funding, and this is the scope of the initial operating segment. The legislature is going to want to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed scope change. The previously planned initial operating segment would have gone from the Central Valley into the Los Angeles area and would have served a much more populous region of the state, and according to the authority's estimates, would have had a much higher level of ridership than the now proposed initial operating segment into San Jose. However, the authority would have required at least another $10 billion for the much higher capital costs of that segment, and they have not identified the funding to complete that as scheduled. And so we think that to the extent the legislature wants to continue the development of a high-speed train system, that the proposed scope change has some merit. Because it is much more likely that a full funding package for the iOS north into San Jose could be achieved than the previously planned initial operating segment into the Los Angeles basin. To the extent that the legislature concurs with the scope change going into San Jose, the legislature is going to want to consider whether or not the iOS has standalone value. As I said before, under the authority's plan, building this initial operating segment would exhaust all of the identified funding sources for this project. And so it is unclear when additional funding would become available, and perhaps unlikely that it would become available on the timeline the authority is assuming to complete the remainder of phase 1 of the project. And so to the extent that the funding does not become available, you're going to want to ensure that whatever is built, a $20 to $30 billion project, that has standalone value, that has a scope that meets your priorities. And in particular, I think Mr. Richard already addressed the issue of the southern terminus. We think that there's options there, and the legislature does not need to concur with stopping the project in an agricultural area. We think that could be problematic. That's not consistent with the CEQA approval for the project. It would require additional environmental review, and also would end the train in an area that does not have the services necessary to meet the needs of passengers in terms of transit connections, rental cars, parking lots, and those types of facilities. The legislature could direct the authority to have the last stop on the train system to be one stop north of that, which is a planned permanent station. You could also make it a priority to identify the $2 billion in additional funding necessary to extend the line into Bakersfield. And those are just some examples, but we think that ensuring that the scope is something that meets your priorities and makes sense is going to be an important issue for the legislature to consider. And lastly, the remaining issue that we want to highlight for you is just ensuring that the project has adequate legislative oversight. Your staff agenda notes that we have not a recommendation, but a sort of an issue to consider, that the legislature needs detailed information on the cost, scope, and schedule of the high-speed rail project. Information that's provided in the business plans as well as other reports that come to the legislature can be extremely difficult to compare from one plan to another, and it makes it very challenging to track changes in cost and schedule over time, because the information reported in one plan may relate to a specific scope, and as that scope changes over time, it's very difficult to understand if the cost changed as well. Is that because of a change in scope, or is it because costs have gone up or gone down? And so we think that the legislature may want to require more detailed information and specify certain scopes of work in order to ensure that information is comparable over time. We think you also would want to consider requiring future business plans to include information on all of the costs and not just capital costs. The authority, if they do finance a portion of the construction of the system, could have very high financing costs, and that's a significant factor for the legislature to consider, and would require funding to pay those. And so you may want to have a more complete picture of the total costs of the project. I'll end my comments there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the detailed presentation. Let's move on to the panel discussion now, and I'll call forward, I think, Michael Turner's here from LA Metro, LAMTA, Jeff G., Redwood City Council member, and Jim Hartnett from Caltrain.
He wants to stay.
Yeah, well, no, we have 3 seats, so I think, yeah, we're good. Welcome.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Michael Turner on behalf of the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And I want to start by saying that we have long supported the high-speed rail project. We actually urged the legislature to include the connectivity funding in the original legislation that put the measure on the ballot. We're using that money now to build the regional connector, which will help link our light rail lines throughout Los Angeles County and help connect people to Union Station, which we hope ultimately is one of the key stations on the high-speed rail project. We also supported SB 1029 when it was considered, I believe, in this room a few years ago, that created the funding for the bookend investments on the project. And we considered then, and we consider that now, to be a key element in the strategy to maintain a statewide consensus on the high-speed rail project. We've been working very closely with the Office of the Secretary, the Board, and with Jeff on the project ever since they've come on board, and we've had a very good working relationship with them. We think the MOU provides a good framework and a good basis for those discussions to continue. But within that, there are challenges that we face. With the business plan and the change going to the north, that is a big change. We still support the project, but that's a big change. And we're going to have to work through that, and we think the MOU gives us some ability to do that. So what we have to do is look at the projects that are in that MOU. There's some updating of those. We've done a lot of work on Union Station, a lot of discussions with the High-Speed Rail Authority about the nature of the improvements there. There's been a lot of discussion about the Rosecrans Marquardt, say it correctly, grade separation, and how those things should be addressed. So we've got a list of projects that we think provide a very solid basis for discussions. And then where we have to get to is what specific commitments do we make to those specific projects. There are key questions about the use of funds in this. There are the high-speed rail bond funds, the cap and trade funds. We would want to look at those first. There have been other discussions about the freight funds from the new federal legislation, as well as other categories of cap and trade. And we think there are conversations to be had there, but we would suggest that in the course of discussing the high-speed rail project, we also have to keep in mind that we have a significant freight challenge in our region, because we are home to the largest port complex. And so in addition to the grade separation project we're talking about, there are other corridors of national significance that need attention. We also have challenges with greenhouse gas emissions in our region and a very high population of our county that lives in disadvantaged communities. And when we're looking at the cap and trade funds, we need to look at the highest and best uses of those and how we use those as well. So we're encouraged that the authority has taken a very proactive approach in working with us in having these conversations. We've had good conversations thus far, and we're encouraged that as we work through the MOU, we will continue to have those conversations. But ultimately, what we need to get to is specific commitments of specific funds to specific projects. And as I mentioned, our priority would be to look at the 1A and the cap and trade funds, and then we can have a conversation about the freight and the cap and trade funds and how those fit in to our overall program as well. So with that, I'll conclude and move on.
Thank you. Who's going next? Mr. G?
Yeah, okay. I think you're listed.
Oh, I'm next. Okay.
You're next on my list, but
Okay.
you can go in
All right,
any order
that's
you
fine.
like.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Members of the committee, Jeff G., council member of City of Redwood City. And just to calibrate, Redwood City is located about in the middle between San Francisco and San Jose on the peninsula. And in my other roles as an elected official, I also serve on the San Mateo County Transit District Board, the Caltrain Board of Directors, the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority Board, and chair of the Commute.org, which is San Mateo County's transportation demand management organization. Other than going to a lot of meetings, what that means also is I get to hear a lot from our constituents about the challenges of moving around the Bay and the peninsula. And the investment in Caltrain and high-speed rail is a big tool into helping our community move around the peninsula. It's a much-needed tool to move not only throughout the state of California, but from San Francisco to San Jose and south and north. And when Caltrain is complete with its modernization program, and we are just about at the shovel-ready moment later on this year, the Caltrain capacity will nearly double, which is a big, big deal for our region. My role here is to represent local government. And as some of our constituents have said, just run more trains, I find myself at a very delicate balance as being a local elected official that running more trains is great for the region, but that's a north-south corridor. And what that means for my east-west connectivity is more gate time. More gate time means longer cars, lines of cars waiting, more greenhouse gas emissions, particularly at my at-grade crossings near my residential neighborhoods. And so at the local government level, what we're looking for is concurrent investment in local communities to help make a difference so that we can run more trains, not have longer gate times or more gate times, longer cars of waiting, more greenhouse gas emissions. and that we can run more trains safely, more environmentally friendly, and at a local level, less impactful to our communities. The planning and design of these improvements need to be concurrent with high-speed rail and with the Caltrain modernization. And it really makes a huge difference that when we can do these things together, that our local communities can benefit from that. We have about 47 at-grade crossings throughout the peninsula segment, that many of these, if we can find ways to partner together to separate road, cars, and trains, will make a huge difference on our mobility needs in the region. They're a top priority for both Caltrain and for Samtrans. And, I can see the benefit in our city alone. Right outside of our city hall, we have the Jefferson Avenue undercrossing that was built in the 90s and commissioned in 1999. Trains and cars, north-south, Caltrain, east-west, car and trucks, they coexist peacefully without any conflict. Trains can run, and there's no backups. What we've learned when we do road diets in my city, that if we upset motorists by 30 seconds or a minute, they become very emotional and very passionate, and they let us know. And so if we are able to work together, find ways to collaborate with local government to grade separate trains and at-grade crossings, we can find ways to move people better across our region. So I'm here to help advocate for that concurrent investment, not just for Redwood City, but for all of my fellow elected colleagues up and down the peninsula. Jim?
Thank you, Council Member. And so we'll wrap up now with Mr. Hartnett from Caltrain.